looking at a quarter of the book of Genesis on Joseph. We take a little side trip with Judah. We're in chapter 38 of the book of Genesis. By the way, if you're doing the chronological Bible study, as two of the churches that I work with are doing, I hope that you're staying up with your reading every day. I know that it's a little difficult to find 10 minutes every day, but try to do the best you can, and catch up is not too bad if you only get a day behind, but if you get 2 or 3 days behind, it gets a little difficult. Chronological Bible study is very, very interesting, and I hope that you're trying to go through the Bible in a year with the chronological Bible and the Bible study work that goes with it. Chapter 38, verse 1, it says that Judah departs. It's an interesting statement. He's got 11 brothers, and some of them have some spirituality to them. Certainly Reuben showed a little bit of spirituality, and we look at the chart of the different brothers, and Reuben, of course, being the oldest, maybe the wisest because of the longevity, but nevertheless we see that Judah departs, and he goes into a Canaanite area, and there he meets his soon-to-be wife, Shua. And Shua and he bear 3 children, at least 3 that are listed for us. The first one is Er. The second one is Onan. The third one is Shelah. Now, it's really interesting because from this Canaanite woman, we find these 3 children that are born, and Judah evidently likes them, concerned about them, and so he goes out and finds a wife for Er, and her name is Tamar. Tamar is Canaanite also, but she seems to have some principles about her. So when Er marries her, it's quite clear that the Bible tells us that Er was evil, and that he was one that did not please God, because it says in verse 7, the Lord took him. So Judah tells Onan, the second born, I want you to go to Tamar and do as our custom calls for, and that is to take her as your wife and raise children with her. That is your obligation since your brother died. But we find that Onan is just as evil and just as malicious as his brother Er was, and rather than to have relations with Tamar, it says he wasted his seed. And it says that in verse 10, the Lord took him. Then Judah says to Tamar, why don't you remain a widow until Shelah, the third son, gets old enough to marry you, and then I'll allow him to marry you, and you can have children with him. Now, this is where Tamar demonstrates that she has more principles than you'd expect from a Canaanite. And she waited patiently for Shelah, but Judah never does deliver his promise. So Tamar has a plan. And her plan is very simple. She's going to clothe herself in such a way that she looks like a prostitute priestess with a veil so that Judah wouldn't recognize her. Recognizes that Judah's wife has passed on, that he's probably looking for some companionship of the opposite sex. She waits on the road for him. She bargains to have a relationship with him as a prostitute would. He doesn't have a lamb or a ram to give her, so she asks for some surety. She asks for his signet ring, his cords, and his staff. And off she goes, and off Judah goes. But time passes by, and she shows up to have child. Now, it doesn't take very long since she's not married, and since neither Er or Onan or the youngest son have come to her, she has had a child by Judah, or is getting ready to have a child by Judah. When word gets out, Judah judges her and figures that she has been unfaithful to his family, even though he was not giving his youngest son to her. And he says, let her be burned. But when she is brought out before the crowd to be burned, she shows the evidence of who the real father is of her child. It's none less than Judah himself. She shows the ring, the cords, and the staff. And Judah probably makes the most correct statement that he could possibly make. He says, she's more righteous than me. And it tells us that Tamar had twins, Perez and Zerah. And we find that Zerah, being the firstborn of twins, or at least his hand came out ahead of everybody else, they tied a cord around his hand, a red cord, so that they would know who the firstborn was. It starts the whole philosophy that theologians have carried on about the red or the scarlet cord. We find it again when we see the story of Rahab the harlot in Jericho. But nevertheless, we have 7 lessons, 7 applications to this little side trip of Judah. When you get off on your own, away from the influence of anyone that might keep you in line, it's real easy to fall, and Judah did. Secondly, that he was unequally yoked to a Canaanite woman. Thirdly, that Er was so evil that God took him. That ought to say something to us. Now, I know that he doesn't always do that, but he can. When you're so evil that God sees no purpose in keeping you here on earth, he can take you out. And Onan, who not only disobeyed his father, but he disobeyed God, God took him out too. Tamar obeyed, but her plan was an evil plan. Probably you'd say it's appropriate that she did what she did to Judah, since Judah was not a man of honor. She revealed him for a man of not being of honor. Be sure your sins will find you out, Tamar could have easily said to Judah. And then we've also got to remember Judah in crying out, burn her. We've got to be careful that when we judge others, we better be sure we know all of the facts. We better be sure that when we point our finger at someone, that we need to remember that there are several other fingers pointing right back at us. Yes, I think it's important for us to remember these 7 lessons. And that's my thought for the day. I hope you'll keep up with your reading of the book of Genesis. God bless and have a great day.